Let's go into hardening Liferay. This is basically the chapter that we configure after everything is running. We'll try to revert everything and bring it down to 0. Because, as my opening slide says here, the most secure system is neither connected to a power outlet nor to a network connection. Everything else is a compromise. And that's a quote by a famous trainer. That's actually myself. We're balancing security and performance. Of course, we want to be as fast as possible, and we want to still be as correct as possible, and we want to be as secure as possible, which means, well, we are accepting live changes to the system, meaning, well, we want some changes and other changes we don't want. Yeah, a lot of the security within Liferay just, first of all, depends on the roles and the proper permissions that are given in the system. So that's just number one. That's not you guys, that's the content people, that is whoever gives permission to whoever is working on the system. Of course, full administrative power, the so-called omni-admin, the administrator, default user on Liferay, should always be rarely used, if at all. So ideally, you're not working as root, as well as you're not working as administrator, only if you absolutely need that power. Of course, it's quite flexible. In all our trainings, or in most of our trainings, we just work as administrator because we don't want to limit us in any way, shape, or form. But I'm not ashamed to say that the very first plugin that I wrote for Liferay, that was before I joined the company, before I had my first training, was working really well as long as I was signed in as an administrator, and it fell flat on its face as soon as I was logged in as a regular user. Because, hey, who cares for that? Like, who tests for that? Now, it was my first plugin, and it's not that bad. However, just keep that in mind. The very first layer of protection is always the permissions that you give users in your local system. Now, for hardening, of course, now this is the more appropriate DevOps hardening. We are talking about the network layer, we're talking about the operating system and the application. And I just want to mention a few of the issues that I see every single time, or not every single time, but actually quite often in some systems, which is just the sheer administration of the operating system. So yes, you might be a Liferay administrator, and if you are not a Linux administrator, you should get some help in operating the Linux machine, as well as vice versa, in case you are proper administrators for your underlying operating system, be it Windows, be it Linux, and you're here to get the proper Liferay knowledge. Congratulations, you're at the right place. So you should at least know what you should do. No root level access, use sudo only, unless you're starting Tomcat. I think I've mentioned that in one of the earlier chapters. I'm seeing some forum posts that say, I'd like to bind to port 80. So what do? Well, you configure port 80 and then you just run sudo startup for Tomcat. Yeah, that works, but it's not part of the hardening process here at all. Now with Docker, you can do some port mapping, that works, or HA proxy, Apache, HTTPD. That's just the basic information, or the basic protection that you can have there. Of course, you want to limit access to the servers. We have enabled GoGo Shell for DXP 7.1 in our Docker installation, so that you can use GoGo Shell to go into the OSGi runtime and actually manipulate it, if you know what you're doing there. In production systems, I would like to recommend to switch it off. Liferay DXP 7.0 had it on by default, but you can switch it off exactly the way, well, the opposite way that we switched it on in this session. Just look at your configuration. That's in Portal Ext properties. Look for 11311. That's the port that we're configuring, and you will easily find which setting to just omit, and then you are set, or set it to blank in DXP 7.0. Now, Speaking of portal properties, there are some suggestions here. Do you need strangers to sign up to your portal? We are using Liferay on liferay.com and for the community side, which means we have it on. We do accept and are willing and actually are encouraging everybody to have an account on liferay.com. It's quite easy to do. You just create it and you're in. You get access to all of the systems that we have in this network, to the forums, to the blogs and others. If you're running a pure intranet, if you have more control over your users, if you run a partner network where your partners don't sign up by themselves, but you sign them up, then you don't need company security strangers. You don't want these strangers to come up and just create an account for themselves. And if you don't want OpenID or any other system that otherwise Liferay would just offer, you can switch them off. How do you figure out what you can set here? Any guesses? And no, it depends is not the answer this time. Again? Read portal properties, correct. The other correct answer. Yay. So again, read portal properties and you will see that there are some properties in there that say layout user public layouts enabled. What does that mean? Well, where you find these settings, you will also find a bunch of lines of documentation, and they will explain what these settings are all about. In other words, if you really want to know what these mean, then read portal properties, Control F, find one of these settings, and you will be able to see the documentation for them. In this case, users' public pages, which are profiles, users' private pages on the bottom part, which are the dashboards. Change the admin user. One of my pet peeves is I do not like this setting to be in there. Why would we want to have a default password anywhere? Well, if you run with a setup wizard, then you got to know what, well, if you run with setup wizard, and if you install Liferay with a setup wizard, you get asked for a password immediately. So this doesn't even get active, but it's still a good idea to change it. After all, if you create a new instance, so-called instance or virtual instance, then you don't create a user, but there will be an automatic creation of a user with exactly that password. So even if you already have changed the password, it's still a good idea to change that to some gobbledygook, which then will be the password of the administrative user of an extra instance. Personally, I don't like any standard password in any system anyways. Default admin screen name and default admin address prefix. This is where the famous test@liferay.com with password test comes from. Yeah, if we could get rid of it, I would be very happy. However, you can, of course, get rid of it with exactly these settings or with just changing them immediately. As I have already mentioned, creating a new instance in Liferay, there's the admin email address prefix. Any new instance that you create will have an administrator with that prefix at and then the domain that you give for your new instance. Every instance must have a domain, and that's what's constructing the administrative user of that instance. Password hashing, I think we beat that horse to death. And here it is. This is what I never can remember. PBKDF2 with HMAC SHA1 160 128,000. So our default password configuration is we have password-based key derivation function 2 with what does HMAC stand for? Whatever, using SHA1 hash, 160-bit for 128,000 times. This is what drains your CPU if lots of people sign in at the same time. So in performance tuning, you want that out. In hardening, you want that in, and you want to increase the number. We have a bunch of password hashing options. and I would say they go from quite secure, from industry standard to absolutely unsecure, but they go quickly to somewhat not really secure, even if you use, well, after all, there's MD5 and so on in there. It's still supported, yes, but I would say mainly for legacy systems where we just need to make sure that we get old passwords that you get from some other system or from a really ancient Liferay system into the present, and you can use them as legacy, but you actually want them out. Speaking of migration from older algorithms, this is how it works. You can migrate from older algorithms by just specifying the password encryption algorithm legacy. Notice that it says encryption here, but it's actually hashing. But still, this is what we live with. This is what the Portal properties contain. It says encryption, even though that's technically wrong. And if you happen to have MD5 passwords in your database, then just set this settings, and upon the next login, provided Liferay does the password check, not LDAP, your password will be updated with the proper encryption algorithm. We have a bunch of filters that provide you single sign-on functionality. Remember, during the single sign-on chapter, I told you if you need a custom login, go for the single sign-on interface. This is where you can actually look up how it's done. We have all of the filters so that you can easily integrate with any single sign-on system supported. All of them are active, and you can deactivate them one by one. If you know you're not using CAS, you're not using NTLM, you can just switch them off. So that closes a loophole just in case somebody finds an issue with NTLM and you're not using it. You don't need to use it. You can also just write your own login hooks that determine who you are with, who is the current user. So that's something that you can do, or you can just make sure they are empty and nobody is running that anymore. Non-OSGi portlets, or non-used OSGi portlets, non-used portlets, you can delete them. You can deactivate them from the system, and Liferay will make sure that they are not activated again. As it says back up before deleting, I don't really agree with that. You don't need to back up before deleting because you're backing up anyways. So why do a special backup before? I would just go the other way. It's like, yeah, delete them or deactivate them. If it doesn't work, restore your backup. I don't care if you did a backup. I care that you have one. Okay, and we're already through this review, but I want to actually quickly, you can already start thinking about what is your favorite recommendation in starting up Liferay, in hardening Liferay, because this was just a very brief overview of things that you might want to do, apart from reading Portal properties, where you can find some other things. And we're going to discuss some more, but I want to turn around to you guys here in the room and also encourage everybody out there to just brainstorm what do you actually work on when you install a Liferay system. So what's your favorite recommendation? But let's go here. Hardening is a process of securing a system by reducing its vulnerability, is what my solution says. And there are three primary layers of hardening, which is the network, the server, the operating system, which we didn't discuss, and the application. Now, as this says, the network as well, I want to come back to one of the previous chapters where I have hinted at this. When you have a reverse proxy, you have the choice between HTTP and AJP and maybe other protocols as well. And I just want to remind you that yes, you can go with HTTP, which is unencrypted. Yes, you can go with HTTPS, which is encrypted, but it's a different tunnel than what is used between the browser and the web server. So that can be used. Yes, you can encrypt this connection, or you can go with AJP. And AJP inherently is not encryptable unless you tunnel it through a virtual private network between the the servers that you have. So if you're running in the cloud and you're communicating through AJP, you are definitely running unencrypted. in that cloud network. So you might want to run a local VPN between the machines, or you might want to run HTTPS, unless you do trust the network between the machines, and that is what you'll have to decide. Do you trust the network between your machines or not? I'll leave that up to you. There we're back at it depends. Operating system, of course. We have provided you with the best practices to set up the Docker image or the Docker container with an unprivileged user. You're running with a user called Liferay, which is non-root, which is good. And on the application server side, there's more, but this is no Tomcat training, there's no WebSphere training. So yes, there is more to do on the application server side. We're going to discuss more on the Liferay side.